Hey guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. Before we get into today's video, I just want to say thank you so much for 4,000 subscribers. I meant to say this in the beginning of my last video, however I had a lot on my mind and I just completely blanked and forgot. But I am so thankful for every single one of you and I just think this is so cool. But yeah. Also, if I look a little bit crazy today, it is because I am so tired, I am so sleep deprived. I don't know what's going on lately, but I just cannot sleep. I'm such a homebody and I'm obviously not living at home right now, so sleeping is a little bit difficult for me, but I still wanted to sit here and film a video for you guys today. So with that all being said, let's get right into it. Today we are going to be talking about the Gainesville Ripper, and the reason that I decided to talk about this specific topic today is because Halloween is just around the corner, and this case is the case that inspired the Scream movies. And I feel like that Scream mask is so Halloween. Like in the 90s, like everybody knew what that Scream mask was. I didn't even know what the Scream movies were when I was young, but I remember seeing that Scream mask everywhere. And then you had like that thing that you could squeeze and the blood would come down it. Yeah, so with Halloween being around the corner, I thought that this case was very fitting. So today we're going to be talking about the Gainesville Ripper, and this took place in Gainesville, Florida in August of 1990. On August 23rd, 17-year-old Christina Powell, along with her friend Sonia Larson, were setting up their new apartment, which was just a couple of blocks away from the school that they would be attending in Florida, which was Florida University. The girls were really excited to be roommates, they were really excited to get the school year going, and they wanted their apartment to look comfortable and kind of like aesthetic, I'm gonna say. So they had gone to Walmart and they'd pick up all this stuff, and then they came back and they had decorated their apartment. But after this, nobody had heard or seen the girls. Christina had plans for that Sunday, which would have been the 26th, which was the last day before school had started, with her parents for them to come down and visit her at her apartment. However, her parents could not get a hold of her, and this did alarm them a little bit, but because she was about to start university, this was the first time that Christina was living on her own, her parents just thought that maybe she was kind of caught up in that life, and she just forgot to call them back or forgot to, get into contact with them. So they still planned on going to see her Sunday, and so on the 26th, they left their house and they headed to Christina's apartment. However, when they arrived there, they were knocking and knocking on the door and nobody was answering. This really caused Christina's parents to freak out, understandably, because they hadn't been able to get a hold of their daughter for days at this point, and now they were at her apartment and nobody was opening the door when they had these plans set in stone with their daughter. So they were very, very concerned. So they decided at this point to call the police, who arrived at the scene pretty quickly and knocked down the door, revealing something absolutely horrifying. Police had first found Sonia's body, and she was laying in her bed, suggesting that she was still asleep when the attack had first started taking place. She was stabbed over 20 times and had defensive wounds on her hands, as if she was trying to fight her attacker off. It also appeared that she had sticky stuff around her mouth, which suggested to police at this time that it had been taped shut. And it also appeared that the killer had done this to her and then dragged her body to the bottom of the bed. She was then posed in a very sexually degrading manner. Following this, the attacker then proceeded to go downstairs where Christina was asleep on the couch and kill her as well. Now, Christina had no idea that any of this was going on because obviously Sonia could not scream because her mouth was taped shut. Had been raped and she had been stabbed 5 times in the back, which was her cause of death. On top of that, police found sticky residue on her hands, her feet, and her mouth, suggesting that the killer had not only duct taped her mouth, but had also obviously duct taped her hands together as well as her feet so that she couldn't fight back. On top of that, he had also mutilated Christina, cutting off her nipples and taking them with him. She was also posed in the exact same sexually degrading manner as Sonia. And then just 8 hours after this horrific scene was discovered, a student who had been working in the sheriff's department didn't show up for her shift. Krista Hoyt had been living in a similar apartment to Christina and Sonia. It was just a couple blocks from the University of Florida, which is where she was attending school, and she should have been at her shift at the sheriff's department that day. She was very, very on schedule. She never missed a shift. She always would call, so immediately when she didn't show up, they knew that something was not right. On August 27th, Krista had left for work, and that is when somebody had broken into her apartment and waited for her to return home from whatever she was doing that day. Once she got home, the attacker walked up from behind and attacked her without her even realizing that he was there. She had defensive wounds all over her body, suggesting that she really put up a good fight. However, the killer still managed to assault her and then took her life. Now, like I said, Krista Hoyt took her job at the sheriff's department very, very seriously. So immediately when she didn't arrive that day on time, and then a few hours had passed and she still wasn't there, police knew that something was wrong and they decided to go and check out her apartment. When police had arrived at the scene, they broke down the door and they went into her apartment, and they went into her bedroom, and that is where they saw Krista's head sitting on the bookshelf in her room. Her body was also posed on the edge of the bed, but again, she had been decapitated. At this point, police were certain that they had a serial killer on their hand and that both of these cases were related. The news broke to all of the Gainesville residents that there was a serial killer on the loose that was targeting young women. Everybody in Gainesville started to panic. And that morning, there would be 2 more bodies discovered. These were the bodies of Tracy Paulus and her roommate Manny Taboda. These two had been friends since they were in high school, and they were extremely close, and that is why they decided to live together. They had no romantic involvement, they were just very good friends, they got along really well, and when they found out that they were going to the same university, they thought that it would be in their best interest to just be roommates. On August 27th, the killer had broken into Tracy and Manny's apartment looking for Tracy. It is speculated that the killer didn't even know that Manny was living there. However, the first room that he had come across when he entered the home was Manny's room. Manny was asleep in his bed when the killer began stabbing him. Now this obviously woke Manny up, and he tried to fight off his attacker, and he was making a lot of noise and there was a lot of ruckus, so it is speculated that all of this noise during this attack woke Tracy up, and she ran to Manny's room to see what was going on. And it also is speculated that Tracy had tried to help Manny. However, when she realized that she was not able to do this and she was unsuccessful, she then ran back to her room and tried to barricade her door so that the killer could not get to her. Manny Taboda sadly passed away after being stabbed over 30 times. After killing Manny, the killer then tried to get access to Tracy's room, which he was successful in doing so. He kept Tracy alive for quite some time, terrorizing her and then brutally killing her as well. Now there wasn't just another 2 murders, but one of the victims was a very large athletic man. So this obviously set even more fear into the people of Gainesville. On top of that, all of these murders were extremely brutal, and they took place in the span of just 3 days. And after these 3 days with these 5 brutal murders, it had seemed that the killings had just stopped. Now, police had made a lot of connections between each of the victims. All of them besides Manny were very petite brunette women with brown eyes. They were all Caucasian. All of them lived in an apartment near the University of Florida, and all of them had large glass sliding doors that looked either into a forest or an area where the killer could hide and watch these women through the glass doors. And that's exactly what this creep was doing. He was hiding at night outside of these women's apartments, watching them through these glass windows that they had, and when he saw his opportunity, that is when he would break into the home using a screwdriver and attack. Another thing is, it would seem that the killer would stay in his victim's home for several hours after he had murdered them. He would do things like eat, shower, lay on the couch. It just seemed like he was at his own house, like hanging out, which is extremely unsettling. On top of that, he had cleaned all of the victims using vinegar. He had also duct taped all of the victims, but then after he was done murdering them, he had then removed the duct tape and taken it from the scene with him. On top of that, all of the victims were posed in a very sexually degrading manner. Obviously, with the amount of murders that had taken place in such a short period of time, police were really pressed and wanted to figure out who was doing this. However, they didn't have any victims. So they set up this call line that people could call in and give tips, and the phones to this call line were ringing off of the hook. And a name that kept coming up over and over and over again was an 18-year-old by the name of Edward Humphrey. Edward Humphrey had at one point been living in the same apartment complex as Tracy Paulus and Manny Taboda. Now, he wasn't the most stable guy. He was on medication for mental illness. However, he kept stopping taking his medication. He would just stop taking it. And he was known to be a very strange guy. He would talk to a lot of the people that he knew about murder and wanting to commit murder. And he just was very odd and seemed to have violent tendencies. Shortly after his name started to come up on the call lines constantly, he was arrested during one of these manic episodes that he was having for attacking his own grandmother. So he was definitely a violent individual. After this attack on his own grandmother, Edwards was then taken to a mental facility where he was evaluated and he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, because he attacked his grandmother and because of all of the things that he was saying, it did prove that he was definitely capable of committing a crime as heinous as all of these murders. Police talked to him and it seemed that he knew a lot of details about the case, but it didn't seem as if he knew any private details or anything like that. But he was definitely a suspect at this point. However, when they tested some of the DNA that was found at the crime scene and they tested Edward's DNA, it turned out to not be a match. Edward was blood type B, whereas the killer was blood type A. This put the investigation back to stage 1. They had a violent killer on the loose and they had no suspects. This is when the FBI got involved and they gave investigators access to a database called VICAP, which basically gives you, I guess, like a list of all of these really violent crimes, and it will give you like the crimes that are related or have similarities to them. They had found 8 cases that had similar kind of things to all of these murders. However, one of these cases had striking amount of similarities to the murders that had taken place in Gainesville. This was a triple homicide that had taken place in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1989. Julie Grimson, who was 24 years old, and her father William Grimson, who was 55 years old, and her 8-year-old nephew Sean had been getting ready for dinner when someone had broken into the home and had violently attacked the family. They had all been stabbed to death with the same weapon that the Gainesville Ripper had used. Julie Grimson was the killer's main target, and she had fit the description of the killer's other victims. She was dragged to the bedroom, stripped naked, tied up with tape that was taken from the scene, and had been posed in a degrading manner. And her cause of death was 3 stab wounds to the back. At this point, it was pretty obvious that the Grimson case was related to all of the Gainesville Ripper cases and that whoever had done this was the Gainesville Ripper. Now, police went back and looked at that hotline and all of the suspects that they had. They had 675 suspects, but they focused all of their energy onto Edward Humphrey, who obviously was no longer a suspect. He was completely eliminated from the suspect list. So they started to look at all of the other 674 victims, and they were able to kind of narrow it down by who was in Louisiana at the time that the Grimson murders had taken place. While police were narrowing down the suspects by using this list, a man was arrested near Gainesville, Florida for armed robbery. This man was originally from Sheriff's Point, Louisiana, and he was wanted by Sheriff's Point, Louisiana police for the attempted murder of his own father. This man's name is Danny Rowling. He was born on May 26, 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was the oldest of 2 boys born to father James and mother Claudia Rowling. Claudia was a stay-at-home mom and James was a police officer. Now, James, Danny's father, was said to be an extremely abusive man, not only to his wife, but also to his children, and it was like extreme. Like, he had made his wife self-harm herself and she was put into the hospital for that. He would do absolutely terrible things to his own children. He was just a really, really terrible man. So because of this, Danny left the house as soon as he could. He joined the Air Force at 17, but he only stayed in the Air Force for about 2 years. And then he would kind of make a career in crime. And throughout Danny's entire adult life, he would spend his time going back and forth from being free on the street committing crimes to spending a little bit of time in prison and then getting released and committing more crimes and then going back to prison. So at the time when Danny had tried to kill his father, he had just been released from prison and moved back in with his parents, and this was in 1990. For whatever reason, James and Danny got into this big blowout, and James pulled a gun on Danny, so he was going to shoot his own son. He chased Danny out of the house with this gun, and Danny went to his car. However, instead of just getting into his car and driving away, Danny then pulled out a gun that he had in his vehicle, and he took it into the house and shot his father point blank between the eyes. James ended up surviving this wound. However, Danny thought that he had killed his father, so he left the scene immediately and went on the run and ended up in Ocala, Florida, where he was arrested for the attempted murder of his father. Now, the interview with Danny, everybody that spoke to him said it was extremely strange. Danny seemed like a child who was getting in trouble for something and was trying to act sincere, but he really was not sorry at all. Like, you could just tell, like, he was acting extremely strange. After being arrested for the attempted murder of his father, Danny was then taken for a psych evaluation where he was set up to talk to this doctor. Now, while talking to the doctor, Danny allegedly had asked the doctor, you know, "Is everything that I say to you confidential?" To which the doctor replied yes, and then Danny proceeded to confess to this doctor that he was the Gainesville Ripper. I'm not very, I guess, educated on this specific topic, but I did think, maybe it's only in Canada and not in America, but I thought that when you're talking to a doctor or a therapist, whatever you tell them is only confidential if you don't plan on hurting yourself or somebody else, or you haven't hurt yourself or somebody else, in which case I thought they were able to call authorities or, you know, get you the help that you needed. But for some reason in this case, it doesn't seem that that was what happened. It seemed that this was confidential and the doctor knew all this now and wasn't allowed to tell anybody. In particular that Danny had told this doctor that I do want to mention here is that he had told this doctor in confidence that he had killed Krista Hoyt, and then he had left the scene, got home, realized that he forgot his wallet in her apartment, returned to her apartment, realized that nobody had discovered her body yet, and that is when he decided to decapitate her and put her head on the bookshelf, for the pure shock factor of it all. Looking into Danny Rowling, that is when police came across an armed robbery that had taken place the exact same day that Krista Hoyt was murdered. This had taken place in Gainesville, Florida, and there were two suspects in this case, a black male and a white male. And after the robbery had taken place, they had seen both of these males hanging out outside of a wooded area, so somebody had called police and police arrived to the wooded area. And once police had got there, the black male just gave himself up, whereas the white male took off running into the woods. The man who gave himself up stayed, and he was obviously questioned by police, and he had told them that his accomplice was a man named Mike Kennedy. Now, police were chasing Mike Kennedy, but he was fast and they couldn't catch up with him. This Mike Kennedy person was completely lost. The police never caught him, but they did find what appeared to be a campsite that he was staying at. He had a tent set up, he had a bunch of clothes there. There was a bag there that was full of money that had red dye all over it, which was obviously taken from the bank earlier that day when they did the bank robbery. And so they took all of this guy's stuff and they brought it into evidence. However, at the time that this man was arrested, which was on, or I guess he wasn't arrested because he wasn't caught, this was the day that Krista Hoyt's body would be discovered, and police did not think that this robbery and the murders were related whatsoever. Now that police were paying more attention to this case, they thought that there was a high possibility that this Mike Kennedy character could in fact be Danny Rowling. They found a ski mask at this campsite, and they tested a piece of fiber that was found on the ski mask against a piece of fiber that was found at one of the crime scenes, and they were a match. They took a second look at all of the evidence that was found at this campsite, and they pulled out a pair of pants that was found at the campsite, and there was a tiny drop of blood that was on these pants, and it was tested, and this was a match for the blood of Manny Taboda. There was also a screwdriver that was found at this campsite, which was the screwdriver that was used to break into every single one of these girls' apartments. Krista Hoyt's pubic hair was found inside of a sleeping bag that was on the campsite. And so all of this together just confirmed that whoever Mark Kennedy was responsible for these murders. At the campsite, while collecting evidence, police had also come across a tape recorder. When they had first come across the campsite, they never listened to the tape recording because it just wasn't important, but now it was, and so when they listened to whatever was on the recorder, it turned out to be none other than Danny Rowling himself, kind of leaving a message behind for his mom and his brother. In this recording, he was basically telling his mom and his brother that he would be on the run for the rest of his life and not to worry about him because he was a big boy and he could take care of himself. Being held at this time for armed robbery, so police went to question him, but he really didn't say much. He didn't confess and he wasn't giving very much. He did offer up his DNA, And obviously when police tested his DNA against the killer's DNA, it came back to be a match. Now, something that just seems insane and just really made me question, like, is this guy mentally okay? During one of these interviews, the police had said to Danny, you know, we're gonna need a pubic hair sample to test to see if you're the killer. And Danny then just stood up in front of all of these investigators, pulled down his pants, and ripped out 2 large handfuls of his own pubic hair. Danny Rowling was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of sexual battery, and 3 counts of armed robbery. While in prison, Danny confessed to his cellmate Bobby Lewis, and then a month before his trial date, Danny said he wanted to confess, but he didn't want to say this directly to police. He wanted to tell them through Bobby. So he would sit beside Bobby and he would whisper his confessions in Bobby's ear, and then Bobby would relay what Danny was saying to him to investigators. Now, obviously, with this going on, this interview took hours, but this was confession nonetheless, and so now they were able to prosecute Danny. Danny confessed to hiding and watching his victims before attacking them. He also confessed to stalking them. However, he never confessed to the Grimson family murders. He said that he would confess to those murders in due time. He had also told police that he wanted to kill 8 people for the 8 years that he had spent in prison for robbery. And if that was actually the case, he was successful in doing so. My heart sincerely goes out to all of the victims' families. This case is disgusting. I can't even wrap my mind around how somebody can be so sick and twisted. It is just absolutely heart-wrenching. But guys, that is going to bring us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.